Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Brad Musil and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be section C of part 2 of chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion. Again, this is section C, Mill's case for why religion is morally problematic. Far from being a catalyst for morality, Mill suggests that religions can actually be morally inhibitory. To begin with, Mill is worried that religion might stagnate moral progress, arguing that, quote, there is a very real evil consequent on ascribing a supernatural origin to the received maxims of morality, end quote. Quote, wherever morality is supposed to be of supernatural origin, morality is stereotyped, end quote, which, quote, prevents them, i.e. moral maxims, from being discussed or criticized, end quote. Footnote 77 cites the source, and thus improved when they should be. Mill laments that, quote, if among the moral doctrines received as part of religion there be any which are imperfect, which were either erroneous from the first, or not properly limited and guarded in the expression, or which, unexceptionable ones, are no longer suited to the changes that have taken place in human relations. And it is my firm belief that in so-called Christian morality, instances of all these kinds are to be found. These doctrines are considered equally binding on the conscience with the noblest, most permanent, and most universal precepts of Christ. End quote. Footnote 78 cites the source. Mill offers other reasons for thinking that religion can actually be counterproductive in terms of teaching morality. For one, he illuminates the selfish nature of moral behavior that is motivated by the fear of eternal consequences, referring to the fear of hell as a, quote, coarse and selfish social instrument, end quote. Footnote 79 cites the source. As he points out, insofar as believers are compelled to behave morally due to fear of the eternal consequences they personally stand to face in an afterlife, there is some question as to whether the behavior thus inspired is truly moral in the first place. After all, such believers are moral essentially out of fear of those personal consequences, which on the face of it certainly doesn't seem to be a very moral motivation. In view of this, Mill writes, quote, what now goes by the name of religion operates mainly through the feelings of self-interest, end quote. Footnote 80 cites the source. Hence, in this scenario, those who must be compelled to act appropriately by the threat of eternal consequences have a vested personal interest in acting morally, which many moral philosophers, for example Immanuel Kant, would insist implicitly detracts from the moral worth of what they are doing. Mill himself describes moral sentiments as those within us that prove sympathetic to the unity of mankind, and the moral motivation inspired by the threat of supernatural consequences is, in this Millian sense, no true moral motivation, but rather a motivation to act on behalf of oneself. In Mill's view, this proves to be, quote, a radical inferiority of the best supernatural religions, end quote. Footnote 81 cites the source. Matz raises an interesting objection pertaining to this point about motivation, suggesting that, quote, a utilitarian like Mill must value, above all, the results of one's actions rather than the nobility or moral worth of action, which is demonstrated by one's motive, end quote. Footnote 82 cites the source. The idea here is that Mill seems inconsistent insofar as he emphasizes motives behind actions in making this point, despite the fact that the moral theory he identifies with, utilitarianism, stresses the consequences that result from actions. Matz asks his reader to imagine two individuals, one whose behavior is motivated by supernatural beliefs and yields good consequences, and one whose behavior is not motivated by such beliefs but also yields good consequences. He points out that, to the utilitarian, the difference in motivation would be inconsequential. Nevertheless, while I understand why Matz raises this concern, I don't believe it undermines Mill's point, especially and unquestionably for those who don't endorse utilitarianism in the first place. I think Mill's point about motives can still be relevant even for a utilitarian, insofar as certain kinds of motives might lead to more desirable consequences. Hence, a utilitarian could argue that those who act from selfless motives generally yield more happiness than do those who act from selfish motives, in which case Mill's point here is very relevant for a utilitarian like himself. Another relevant concern here is the notion of holy wars, and the related hypothesis that religion increases violence. If it is true that religion increases violence, as some argue, footnote 83, as I mentioned in the introduction of the dissertation, Sam Harris offers arguments in support of this hypothesis in his well-known work, The End of Faith, end of footnote 83. Then it can be argued that religion actually inspires immorality. I will say much more about this hypothesis throughout the remainder of the dissertation, and here I limit my comments to the implication of what Mill says about it. Mill asserts that, quote, in truth, mankind had been so unremittingly occupied in doing evil to one another in the name of religion, from the sacrifice of Iphigenia to the Dragonades of Louis XIV, end quote. Footnote 84 cites the source. However, he maintains that, quote, these odious consequences do not belong to religion in itself, but to particular forms of it, and afford no argument against the usefulness of any religions except those by which such enormities are encouraged, end quote. Footnote 85 cites the source. It seems to me that Mill's qualification is a bit suspect. Granting that particular forms of religion refrain from the violence in question, why minimize the existence of those that do? Religion, or anything else that is the subject of a utilitarian analysis, should not be divorced from any of its consequential offspring, whether good or bad. Religion in itself might not necessitate holy wars, but without religion, holy wars by definition would not be possible. Mill also alleges that these nefarious forms of religion are declining in number. In characterizing the progress of religion up to his time, as well as his expectations for it thereafter, Mill claims that a, quote, process of extirpation continually goes on. The immoral or otherwise mischievous consequences which have been drawn from religion are one by one abandoned, and after having been long fought for as of its very essence, are discovered to be easily separable from it, end quote. Footnote 86 cites the source. This shouldn't come as a surprise given Mill's generally optimistic views regarding the evolution of our species as a whole, which are evident in the discussion of his Religion of Humanity. Unfortunately, experience does not seem to corroborate Mill's enthusiasm, and if anything, it seems to have only refuted it thus far. The conflicts plaguing the contemporary world are arguably just as religiously motivated as those in previous eras. While some might find this debatable, few would suggest that we are anywhere near the pinnacle of time Mill predicts, a time in which few evil corollaries remain tangible at all. The events of 9/11 obviously serve as a grim reminder of this unfortunate fact. Mill also suggests that religious teachings provide immoral examples. For instance, he takes exception to the conception of hell and elaborates on the difficulties associated with the recognition of an, quote, object of highest worship and a being who could make a hell, end quote, asking, quote, is it possible to adore such a one without a frightful distortion of the standard of right and wrong, end quote? Footnote 87 cites the source. The creator of such a hell seems too concerned with retribution for Mill's taste, and more significantly, the punishment this creator metes out seems incommensurate with what even the most heinous of criminals deserve for their earthly sins. I will expand on the difficulties related to hell in section C of part 3. Similarly, religious faith can yield moral difficulties. In Fear and Trembling, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard develops a conception of faith whereby it comes to reflect believing in something by virtue of the absurd. Believing in something by virtue of the absurd, in turn, indicates a lack of rational and moral justification for the substance of the belief, i.e., the belief is irrational or transrational. Hence, faith is not thought to be something that can be explained or understood. Instead, Kierkegaard refers to it as a passion, as something that is more directly and personally felt. A, quote, knight of faith, end quote, in turn, is someone who entered into a personal relationship with God, and who demonstrates his faith by believing that, with God, all things are possible, including the absurd. The quintessential example of a knight of faith is Abraham from the Bible, and through the voice of the book's pseudonymous author, excuse me for that one, Johannes de Silentio, Kierkegaard further develops his notion of faith by analyzing the circumstances regarding Abraham's willingness to comply with God's demand that he sacrifice his son Isaac. As a knight of faith, Abraham does not question or doubt God's commands, but follows them with absolute obedience, placing his duty to God above all else, including his ethical obligations to Isaac and the rest of humanity. In the end, what Abraham believes is beyond comprehension, and no amount of reflection will yield a rational or moral justification for it. For instance, there is no reason to believe that he will get his son back, and yet he continues to believe that he will nonetheless. What's more, Abraham does not try to confront God's demand on a rational level. He does not try to understand the demand. As De Silentio says, quote, Abraham had faith and did not doubt. He believed the preposterous, end quote. Footnote 88 cites the source. Similarly, the knight of faith generally, quote, acknowledges the impossibility, and in the very same moment, he believes the absurd, end quote. Footnote 89 cites the source. In sum, De Silentio suggests that knights of faith habitually form such beliefs, saying, quote, the movement of faith must continually be made by virtue of the absurd, end quote. Footnote 90 cites the source, which he reinforces with his depiction of an imaginary contemporary knight of faith who, quote, does not do even the slightest thing except by virtue of the absurd, end quote. Footnote 91 cites the source. While Kierkegaard's conception of faith is certainly more nuanced than it is for most people, it still captures the general sense many have about it, insofar as it suggests that religious faith is something that need not, and perhaps cannot, be rationally or morally justified. Kierkegaard seeks to protect faith from the shallow treatment he thinks it often receives, and more particularly the shallow treatment he thinks it receives from G.W.F. Hegel, whom much of his book is intended to rebut, thanks to which it is seen as something inferior to rational and moral justification. In fact, he suggests that faith represents a higher form of existence, it represents a higher telos, than one steered by the universal standards implicit in reason and morality, and that those few individuals who truly demonstrate faith should be praised for their greatness and their courage. It is precisely this point about faith that has always worried me. While Kierkegaard suggests that, quote, the story about Abraham is remarkable and that it is always glorious no matter how poorly it is understood, end quote, footnote 92 cites the source, I feel that such praise is off the mark, and I am not as inclined to endorse the corresponding movement of faith or to praise those, such as Abraham, who make the movement, and for many of the reasons alluded to by Kierkegaard, or De Silentio, himself. As De Silentio suggests, quote, either Abraham was a murderer every minute, or we stand before a paradox that is higher than all mediations. End quote. Footnote 93 cites the source. Granting that the religious sphere and the faith that represents it cannot be comprehended or understood in universal ethical terms, why deem it higher and better on that account? Footnote 94. Of course, De Silentio insists that there is much more to the picture, and that Abraham did not just go merrily about his life on earth, effortlessly choosing to comply with God's every demand. Instead, he focuses his reader's attention on the fear and trembling, along with faith's concomitant paradox, which Abraham must endure, and which is precisely what De Silentio feels is often overlooked when it comes to the story of Abraham. It is especially this fear and trembling and this solitary confrontation with the paradox of faith that Kierkegaard lauds. It is this that he thinks elevates Abraham to greatness in the first place. It is not easy to ignore the pull of universal norms and ethical standards, but Abraham is able to overcome his anxiety because he has faith, because of the great difficulty De Silentio associates with having to disregard these rational norms and standards, and because the knight of faith must endure a lonely, solitary existence. He deems the knight of faith especially courageous and worthy of admiration, claiming that, quote, no one has the right to lead others to believe that faith is something inferior, or that it is an easy matter, since on the contrary it is the greatest and most difficult of all. End quote. Ultimately, he concludes that faith is not something inferior, quote, but that it is the highest, also that it is dishonest of philosophy to give something else in its place and disparage faith, end quote. End of footnote 94. It seems to me that equating irrational belief with something praiseworthy is itself irrational, and, more importantly for our purposes, potentially very harmful, in which case it does not seem wise to praise it as the highest passion. Besides, it is by definition irrational. Besides, if it is by definition irrational, how can one ever try to rationally elevate it above other passions? Worse yet, condoning such acts of faith could open up the proverbial can of worms, which De Silentio hints at when he asks, quote, is it possible to speak unreservedly about Abraham without running the risk that some individual will become unbalanced and do the same thing? End quote. Footnote 95 cites the source. Surely we do not want everyone acting on orders that they believe they have received from God. On May 11, 2003, a Texas woman named Deanna Laney killed 2 of her sons by stoning them to death in their backyard, and she said that she did so because God commanded her to. A jury later acquitted her of all charges by reason of insanity. Is Deanna Laney really worthy of any kind of praise? Are there any observable moral differences between the case of Abraham and Deanna Laney? In both cases, each believes he or she has been commanded by God to do something that seems clearly immoral and irrational. In the end, all I can say is that I do not understand this kind of higher telos, nor have I felt it. Like De Silentio himself, quote, I cannot make the movement of faith. I cannot shut my eyes and plunge confidently into the absurd. End quote. Footnote 96 cites the source. Nor, more importantly, do I think that doing so is the right thing to do. So this was Section C of Part 2 of Chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and the Utility of Religion, from the Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James.